Welcome back to Reason and Theology. So I want to talk about something I just came across. Bishop Athanasius Schneider is responding to the Vatican's recent document prohibiting the use of the term Co-Redemptrix. There's a little bit of a debate on whether or not it actually prohibits the term. I think the intention of the document is to discourage it. And so in that sense, it appears to have prohibited the term. Whether or not the theology is negated is certainly a different question. And, we explored the document about a week or so ago and did an in-depth video about it. You're welcome to go and check it out if you want to see my thoughts about it and a brief exploration of it. But what I want to do today is take a look at what Bishop Athanasius Schneider is saying about the document. It appears that he has some criticisms and concerns with the document. And, they're not unique to him. I've seen some of these concerns being expressed by a number of people. In case you're not familiar with Bishop Athanasius Schneider, he's a auxiliary bishop in Kazakhstan. And he tends to, weigh in on questions like this of the magisterium. And he wants to say that the magisterium has previously used the term Co-Redemptrix to say that the term can't be used today, or to offer some kind of negative judgment, which the document does, to the use of that title in phraseology. He has some concerns with that, especially in light of multiple popes and multiple magisterial documents using the title. And it kind of raises the question of is there room for reversal when it comes to some of these things? Can the church, contradict itself on these kinds of things? Can it change its decision on judgments like this, using the term one day and then coming back the next and saying, okay, we're no longer going to use it? Is that something that we can conceive of in the magisterium? And if so, if the magisterium can kind of contradict itself, in one magisterial document it's using the term, in another document saying don't use the term, which one do you go with, right? Do you go with some of the older stuff? Do you go with the more recent stuff? So it kind of raises the question of methodology, hermeneutics, and stuff like that. And, these are topics that I often talk about in my theology lectures, especially on the magisterium. So it's of an interest to me whenever I see these discussions kind of play out in real time in these debates that are taking place here. So let's briefly take a look at what Bishop Schneider is saying, and then I'll offer my thoughts on kind of the question that we're seeing here on methodology and hermeneutics and continuity and discontinuity. And then after that, I want to briefly take a look at the news item that just came out that the U.S. bishops have elected a new USCCB president and what we know about him so far. So that's what I want to cover in today's stream. Everybody hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Coming up next on the Michael Lofton Show. So I'm sharing my screen, and let's go ahead and dive in and see what Bishop Athanasius Schneider is saying. Looks like this was an exclusive given to Diane Monsango's Substack. She offers some commentary and additional information about the release of the new document Mater Populi Fidelis by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, which was then approved by Pope Leo XIV per Donum Veritatis, paragraph 18, making it part of the ordinary papal magisterium. It says in relation to the use of the title Co-Redemptrix that the term should not be used, but it does make room for some theology, behind the term. So it allows for, a certain theological perspective of the Virgin Mary as co-redemptrix, but it doesn't want to use the term because it says the term is just too misleading, too easy to misunderstand. And she's talking at the outset a little bit about how there's kind of some differences between the English translation and the original edition that was published on the Vatican website, um, and some changes that were made to the English version, where it says it is always inappropriate to use the title co-redemptrix to define Mary's cooperation, whereas before it had less aggressive language. And Matteo Bruni, who is a Vatican spokesman, has clarified that the English was corrected to better reflect the original Spanish. Um, so she talks a little bit about that, because there was a difference between inappropriate versus inopportune. And then after that is the actual article of Bishop Athanasius Schneider kind of offering his thoughts. And the article is titled, "They could not have been mistaken. The voices, or the voice of the saints, doctors, and the ordinary magisterium of the church in affirming Mary as co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces." And that's a fascinating title in and of itself. I mean, gosh, a whole show could be dedicated to just the title, right? Because the title itself raises theological questions that we could explore. Is it possible that the ordinary magisterium can err? I think that the magisterium itself has already answered that question. And in fact, I have a lecture coming up on this where I'll further substantiate that on November 22nd. You can go to rtcourses.com to reserve your spot. I'm going over this very topic. Can Catholic doctrine change? Exploring the possibility of doctrinal reversals. And we'll see what the magisterium itself says. So go ahead and reserve your spot, rtcourses.com. On the question of the ordinary magisterium, can it err? If we're going to say that the ordinary magisterium, which according to the profession of faith is composed mostly of non-definitive, therefore reformable doctrines, could it err? Well, if something's reformable in nature, by definition, it could err, right? If something is non-infallible in nature, by definition of the term non-infallible, it's potentially fallible. So the magisterium, even in the profession of faith, paragraph 3, that I've spoken about numerous times here, itself acknowledges the idea that certain decisions of the magisterium can be reformed and therefore be in error. And we have seen popes say that, yes, the magisterium can, in some limited cases, err, and other magisterial documents have said the same. So sneak peek for what I'll cover in the lecture. There are some caveats to that. There are some qualifications, and then there are many instances of the magisterium's acts that cannot err, that are irreformable in nature and also infallible in nature. So we have to make sure to distinguish between the types of teachings that we're referring to. So the magisterium wants to hold to both positions. There's some doctrines that are infallible and some that are potentially fallible, some that are irreformable and can never change, and some that are reformable and may not necessarily though, but could potentially change. We've even seen Pope Leo recently explicitly say that doctrine can change. He says in certain doctrines, I think in the case of, he says the church is teaching on homosexuality, he doesn't have any plans to change the doctrine at this time, but he seems to concede that there's a possibility that it could change. Now, whether or not the teachings on sexuality can change, very different question than whether or not some other teachings could change. That in of itself is pretty debatable topic, right? But just objectively speaking, can some things change? The magisterium answers that. In summary, Yes. Is this one of them, however? Is this one of them? Well, Bishop Schneider wants to say no. I mean, the name of the article is They Could Not Have Been Mistaken. The voice of the saints, doctors, and ordinary magisterium of the church in affirming Mary as co-redemptrix. Now, I mean, we do know that there have been saints who have erred on some theological matters. There's been some doctors of the church that have erred on some theological matters, and there have been some reversals in the ordinary magisterium of the church. To commit, however, to the idea that this is one of those that can't reform, one would need to demonstrate a theological argument as to why this is one of those cases. And he doesn't necessarily do that in the article. What he tends to do in the article is he just shows that, here's some saints, here's some doctors, here's some popes, and here's some magisterial documents where the term co-redemptrix is used, and also where the theology in some cases, or at least a particular version of it, is affirmed by the magisterium. But to assert that this is one of those things that can't change, I think some further theological exploration and articles would need to be required to demonstrate that, right? I don't think that was demonstrated in the article. Be that as it may, it's still worth exploring and taking a look at what he says here. So he says, over the course of time, the ordinary magisterium, together with numerous saints and doctors of the church, have taught the Marian doctrines of co-redemption and mediation, employing, among the other expressions, the specific titles co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces. Now, keep in mind that, the Vatican document does acknowledge the theology of co-redemptrix and the theology of mediatrix of all graces, and it does say that the title mediatrix of all graces can be used in a limited sense. But when it comes to the title of co-redemptrix, it's basically saying that's inadmissible. So do keep in mind there's a difference between the theology and the use of the titles, and the document itself makes a distinction between the use of these two titles. He says, consequently, it cannot be maintained that the ordinary magisterium, along with saints and doctors of the church over so many centuries, could have led the faithful astray through a consistently inappropriate use of these Marian titles. And I get where he's coming from on that. I get that. I think what he's arguing here is that these aren't just particular instances of like low-level ordinary magisterium, but I think he might be arguing for a case that this is ordinary and universal magisterium, which may then kind of increase the weight to it. Ordinary and universal magisterium, as I point out in my lectures, and as we see in the documents of the magisterium itself, some of its teachings are reformable, some are irreformable. Most people tend to confuse the ordinary and universal magisterium with infallible. They're not aware that it's not a mode of teaching, or it's not a act of teaching, I should say. It's rather an organ. It's the College of Bishops, and the College of Bishops can teach infallibly or non-infallibly. But I think maybe what he's thinking of here is the ordinary and universal magisterium, and may thinking on that basis that it's irreformable. But it still kind of requires us to explore the question of not just can the ordinary magisterium and its judgments be reversed, but can some of the judgments of the ordinary and universal magisterium be reversed? Fundamentally, the difference is ordinary magisterium we tend to speak of as like ordinary papal magisterium. The Pope's non-infallible teachings is how the term tends to be used. And when we speak of ordinary and universal magisterium, we tend to mean the College of Bishops, all of the bishops as one organ, coming together, not necessarily in a council, but outside of a council, but in agreement that a teaching is true. But it can do so in a definitive way or non-definitive way. So ordinary and universal magisterium, if you look at how it's defined by the magisterium, it can teach definitively or not definitively. So even if we're talking about the OUM, ordinary and universal, it doesn't necessarily mean infallible, right? It could mean that. if they've proposed it as something definitive in nature, then yeah, it is irreformable. But they could propose something in a non-definitive fashion as well, and be in agreement on something in a non-definitive way. Therefore, there could be some reformability to it. So what one would have to demonstrate is that um, the he says ordinary magisterium. He might be referring to the ordinary and universal magisterium. Sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. Um, he would need to demonstrate that this is one of those teachings that cannot err, that cannot be reformed. So there would have to be that dynamic to the conversation that doesn't necessarily take place in the article. Which, in fairness to him, that may not have been the main focus that he wanted to explore in the article. He says, moreover, throughout the ages, this Marian doctrine and the use of these titles have always expressed the sense of the faithful. Therefore, by adhering to the traditional teaching of the ordinary magisterium regarding co-redemption and mediation, and by recognizing the legitimacy of the titles Co-Redemptrix and Mediatrix of all graces, the faithful do not depart from the right path of faith, nor from a sound and well-informed piety towards Christ and his mother. So I think that what he's basically saying is that, if you go with the older judgments of the magisterium over the more recent judgment, you don't err that way. So it does bring us to the question of kind of methodology. If you have the magisterium in the past saying, don't do this, and then the magisterium now saying, do this, or the opposite, right? The magisterium saying in the past, do this, now it's saying, don't do this. Which one do you go with? There's some documents like Mortalium Animos from Pius the 11th, less than 100 years ago, where the Pope is saying you can't have ecumenical prayer meetings. And if you do that, anyone who does that has departed from the faith and doesn't believe the Catholic faith. And now, we have in the post-conciliar period these ecumenical prayer meetings all the time. And it's not seen as departing from the faith or abandoning the Catholic faith. For Pius XI, that was just basically apostasy. For the post-conciliar period and even the council itself, very different perspective, right? So when you come across that, pre-conciliar documents saying don't do this, and the conciliar and post-conciliar documents saying do this, you have to ask the question, which one do I go with? Now, obviously, you have to somehow try to attempt to harmonize these two things, because there may not be a contradiction. But if there's an attempt to harmonize them and you just simply can't harmonize it, maybe if there really is a contradiction, you have to then ask, okay, which one do I go with? The previous judgment, the current judgment? And it raises a question of methodology. Some people have a very simplistic methodology where they basically say, I just go with whatever the most recent thing is. The most recent judgment, that's what I'm going with. Others have the exact opposite judgment, very simplistic, and they just say, I just go with whatever the older judgment was. The reality of the matter, however, is that you're supposed to evaluate the status of these judgments and go with the one that has the higher weight, whether that's in the past, whether that's in the present. You could have something that has a higher weight that outweighs the previous judgments, and it's a recent judgment. You could have a judgment in the past that outweighs a really low level current judgment, right? So you would then go with the previous one, the past judgment. You have to go with the one that has the higher weight, and that requires you to be able to evaluate magisterial documents. Which, hey, as a reminder, y'all, I have courses specifically on this, rtcourses.com. My magisterial studies program has a whole course, how to evaluate magisterial documents. And if you get the lecture for November 22nd, Can Catholic Doctrine Change? It'll give you 40% off this bundle. So take advantage of it. But for those who don't have the time right now to go through the course, evaluating magisterial documents is a complex business, right? It really is. It's a complex thing. It's not something you can do very quickly. There's a lot of things that you have to take into account. Lumen Gentium talks about just a few of them. So does Donum Veritatis. For example, the level of the document, what type of document is this? And, the higher level, the higher the document level, the more weight to the teaching. The frequency of the teaching and also the force of the language used for the teaching, all of that can serve to increase the weight of a teaching and or a judgment. So if you have, a judgment that is in a really high level document with has been repeatedly, affirmed, right? Repetition. And the popes have been really forceful in their judgment and promoting it. And on the other hand, you have the opposite judgment in another magisterial document that's kind of a low level document and it hasn't been repeated very often. And it's not really forceful language. Look, obviously, in that case, you go with the judgment that has a way higher weight, right? Um, so that's what you have to do, but there's a lot involved in that process. And it's not just something you can just do like, well, just go with the old teaching. Just go with the newer one. Yeah, it's a little bit more than that. So I think I understand what Bishop Schneider is, attempting to do here. He appears to take the perspective that, the magisterium and its judgment previously basically says you can use that title, you can use that term. And he mentions some, papal documents. He goes over some examples where they do use that term in both in the pre-conciliar period and in the post-conciliar period, like John Paul II. So he gives some examples of where the title Co-Redemptrix is used, and then of course that's juxtaposed with this pretty low-level papal document by the DDF, approved in common form by Pope Leo, making it ordinary papal magisterium, but like really low level, where it negates that and says that you shouldn't use the title and the term co-redemptrix, right? So I think his argument is that, look, there's a lot of weight to these other documents and the fact that they're using the term. And then you have this other low level document that negates that. Well, you don't err by just going with the past judgments in this particular case. I think that that's kind of what he's presenting here. As far as the saints and doctors, well, they wouldn't technically factor in their use of the term because they don't exercise a binding magisterium on the faithful today, unless you can appeal to a universal consensus among the saints or church fathers or doctors. Then that would be an indicator that something is irreformable. Not that it's somehow this is some kind of magisterial organ, but rather they would be reliable witnesses to sacred tradition. But you would have to show a consensus, as the magisterium would say, and I don't think a consensus has been shown on the use of this term, at least by the saints or doctors of the church. I think you could point to some saints and doctors of the church who used it, and he does, but I don't think that really factors in unless you can show that consensus. And so short of that, it's a little irrelevant, right? Because at that point, you can find saints and doctors of the church that say things that aren't accepted today. There are some saints who said some things that are now labeled heretical. There are some doctors of the church who say some things that are now labeled heretical. For crying out loud, one of our doctors of the church wasn't ever a Catholic, never in formal communion with the Catholic Church. So, you can't necessarily point to them and say, well, they used it, therefore that ends the discussion in a magisterial conversation, because the magisterium is going to override the individual saints. And Thomas Aquinas points that out himself. He says, if the church says something contrary to what I've said, go with the church, don't go with me. So any saint throughout history would tell you If it boils down to what I've said and what the magisterium has said, go with what the magisterium has said. So for me, I'm just going to kind of put the saints and doctors of the church issue to the side because there's not a universal consensus there, and just focus on the question of the magisterium. And in this case, yeah, you do have, John Paul II using the term 7 times. You have multiple liturgical, magisterial documents in the preconciliar period, and even in the postconciliar period, using the term, and then you have one document prohibiting its use. I could see why somebody would just try to say, hey, look, these other judgments kind of outweigh this one, right? And then I could also see why, no, I think that you got to follow the most recent one because it's evaluating those previous ones, and it's the magisterium that interprets the magisterium, not private individuals, not individual bishops, but rather the magisterium is the interpreter of the magisterium, and the magisterium has ruled it's no longer opportune in light of today's circumstances. And so you go with the more recent judgment here because our circumstances are different today, or whatever the argument may be. So I can see why both sides would kind of try to argue, for each position. I get it, right? So I'm sympathetic to everyone in the discussion and why people are confused. And in fairness to really everyone for every position, look, I knew this would happen. It was very easy to predict, right? This is where the magisterium needs to pastorally come back into the conversation, accompany people, to use some nice synodal language here, accompany people who are struggling with this, journey with everyone, and then explain, yes, here's why it was previously used, here's why we're not going to use it. It makes a brief attempt to kind of do that in the document itself, but I think a deeper exploration is needed. And more importantly, taking a step back, I really think the magisterium needs to invest and focus on exploring the question of evaluating magisterial documents instead of the very brief instances where it's talked about this kind of conversation and methodology. When you come to points in tension with the magisterium like this, you have a few documents talking about it a little bit, like Donum Veritatis, but frankly, it needs to be explored and treated in a more detailed fashion. And I think that would be a better use of the time of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith than some of this other stuff, in my personal opinion. I think this is where the dicastery, where maybe Pope Leo himself needs to come out and help people understand this a little bit better. Otherwise, what you're going to have is a lot of people who just struggle, and they just say, well, look, all these other saints said this, all these doctors of the church said this, even popes and magisterium said this, and then you got this one document that says don't do it. Well, I'm just going to go with this other stuff. Well, there needs to be then an exploration as to the question of, well, here's why the most recent judgment of the church is binding and is correct. There needs to be an exploration and examination of that on part of the magisterium. Because here's the thing. If I just do that personally, right, people are just going to say, well, Michael, that's your opinion. Or if Bishop Schneider just does that personally, people would just say, Bishop Schneider, that's just your personal opinion. If some cardinal just does that, or some priest, they'll just say that's their personal opinion. And then they'll present a cardinal who says the opposite, or a bishop who says the opposite, or a priest who says the opposite, or a theologian who says the opposite. And then you just have a game of my bishop beats up your bishop, my cardinal beats up your cardinal, my theologian beats up your theologian, my priest beats up your priest. And we don't really get anything beyond opinion. So I think it would be helpful for the magisterium to kind of offer an authoritative judgment on the matter. And here I'm talking about in offering some methodology and how to process all of this in a nice, succinct, clear-cut way. Like I said, it's got some nuggets here and there, some bits and pieces here and there, and various documents, and you piece them all together, and you can kind of come up with a coherent methodology. And that's what I do in my lectures. But it would be nice to have something in one place where you don't have to do that. because it's a lot easier to just dismiss somebody as, that's just your opinion, that's just your reading of these different documents. It's a lot harder to do that when the magisterium itself comes out in like one document, one doctrinal note that says, here's how to do it, kind of thing. And if this isn't done, here's what's going to happen. People are going to dismiss this document, and they already are. There already are plenty of Catholics who are just saying, I'm just going to keep calling her Co-Redemptrix and ignore what the Vatican is saying. And not only that, but you'll have that with every other magisterial intervention that some people don't agree with. You'll just have Catholics who say, I don't agree with what the magisterium is saying. I'm just going to go do my own thing. So until the magisterium itself comes out and really starts to engage some of this stuff, that's what's just going to happen. People are just going to kind of ignore what's going on in Rome. If I tell my kids, go do this, right? Go do X, Y, and Z. I can just appeal to my authority as a father. And technically they need to obey because I'm their father. You need to obey your parents, right? I could take that approach. Or I could say, do X, Y, and Z, and here is why it is in your own best interest to do this. Kind of get them to buy into it, kind of get them to see why they need to do this. And if you help them understand why, then you can get them to buy into it, and they're going to be personally invested and thus more willing to do it. If the magisterium comes out and just says, don't use this term, and doesn't sufficiently explain, here's why we're changing the judgment, then you're just going to have people who don't buy into it. They don't understand, and they're just going to go with whatever methodology they feel is best, which might be, let me just go with whatever was preconciliar or whatever was before this judgment, right? So we're going to continue to see this happening until I think the magisterium itself intervenes. Those are my thoughts on the matter. I'll put a link to the rest of the article if you want to go and read it, to read the whole thing by Bishop Schneider. I'll put a link to it in the comment section, but those are my thoughts on it and just kind of interacting with it. I hope it was helpful in kind of giving you some general guidance through the discussions. And again, if you want more information, if you want to see an attempt where I do go through different documents here and there from the magisterium and kind of piece together a methodology that it offers on interpreting magisterial documents, again, go to rtcourses.com and sign up for the Magisterial Studies program. But go ahead and just purchase the Can Catholic Doctrine Change lecture that I'm offering on November 22nd, because once you purchase that, you get 40% off this bundle where I have my lectures on the magisterium. So go ahead and take advantage of that discount and save yourself some money. So take advantage of that while that lecture is being offered right now, and while you have that opportunity to get 40% off. So if you want to understand how to read magisterial documents, you want to know more about this, how to think through this as a theologian, you certainly want to explore those courses. So anyways, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear from you all. Of course, drop your thoughts there in the comment section. Happy to hear more. And by the way, I did want to just quickly tell you about this update here. Sharing my screen, the USCCB has chosen a new president, Archbishop Paul Coakley. And if you go to CNA, they talk a little bit about him. 2022 praised Oklahoma lawmakers for supporting pro-life measures. In 2022, he also said the use of the death penalty only contributes to the continued coarsening of society into the spiral of violence. So he's taking the position of Pope Francis and Pope Leo that the death penalty is inadmissible in all cases. So he's against abortion and also against the death penalty. He has expressed some concerns about gender dysphoria promotion in 2023 and has also criticized President Trump's administration on mass deportation and immigration. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of who Bishop Coakley is, the new president to the USCCB. I'll put a link to that in the comment section as well in the show notes, so y'all can go and read more about that if you would like. All right, so that's going to do it for today. Everybody hit the subscribe button and also consider becoming a channel member right here on YouTube. Hit the join button and become a channel member. Get access to plenty of extra content, or go to Patreon, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. Get access to plenty of extra content there. And most importantly, you'll be able to support me so I can continue to offer this kind of material to everybody for free every day. So please do your part if you're able. All right, that's going to do it for now. God bless.